Welcome to another episode of the Swamp247 podcast. I am your host, Graham Hall, joined once again by my co-host, Zach Goodall. And good news, Florida fans, this is not going to be a doom and gloom podcast because the Florida Gators secured a top 10 victory against Texas on Saturday, 29-21 in the Swamp. It was an impressive performance on both sides of the ball, and we are here to break it all down today. Let's jump into it. 2 weeks ago, DJ Lagway had arguably the worst performance of his career. And you wonder why I say arguably, because you could make a case that the week before that at LSU was the worst performance of his career when he had 5 interceptions in Baton Rouge. Well, a week later, he has 61 passing yards against Miami. And Lagway comes out in the postgame and says, I guarantee we're going to get things fixed. This is not acceptable at all. And then he said on Monday, ahead of the Texas game, that when this offense finally pops, you are going to see an offense that is extremely capable. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing his words. We didn't know when that was going to happen, though. 5 days later, Florida hosts the Longhorns, a really good Texas team with some of their own issues, dealing with injury concerns. Arch Manning has not been the quarterback that many people expected that he would be, but certainly a team that has proved capable, was coming off a 55-0 win over Sam Houston State. And Florida just looked like the more impressive team in all phases of the game, quite honestly. We're going to start with talking about Lagway because it was a performance that was similar to the ones you saw last year. It was indicative of his capabilities, his impressive ability, and it showed improvement from him, from reading defenses, connecting with receivers, putting the ball on the money. He looked a lot more comfortable there in the pocket, and Florida's offensive line kept him well protected, didn't allow a sack on the afternoon, and only gave up 3 tackles for loss, which was notably an issue for Florida for the first third of the season. They were one of the worst teams in the SEC in tackles for loss. So a much improved performance, and it started with DJ Lagway. Zach, your thoughts on DJ Lagway's performance, what you saw out of him, and how critical it was to Florida's success on Saturday?
Yeah, to get my, as you coined it, doom and gloom out of the way, I don't want to hang my hat on it and be like, oh, okay, everything's fixed. Everything's great now. The offense should be expected to be way better just because it's one game after the 4 that we saw. However, that's really where I'd cut it, because you got to consider this is one of the best defenses in certainly the SEC, arguably the country, that he just went out and did this against. And obviously, like you mentioned, Texas was without Malik Muhammad, one of the better corners in the country for one, and had some other injury concerns as well. But they really neutralized their pass rush, which has been extremely good this season. They, in addition to not allowing a sack, only gave up 6 quarterback pressures on the day. DJ certainly was his best performance of the season. I would argue, honestly, I think it was one of the best of his career. Sure, it wasn't the 450-yard showing like it was against Samford last year. It wasn't the 3 touchdown, 0 interception games like he had once or twice last year. But coming out and putting up, I think it was 75% completion, but it wasn't just the dink and dunks. It was at over 10.5 yards per attempt. So he was pushing the ball downfield and getting completions. Longest completion of the season, 60 yards to Vernell Brown, that highlight catch. I think he went 51 yards in the air, and he really put it on the money. Also looked the safety off on that play. It was unlike, quite frankly, any throw we've seen from DJ this season. To your point, he looked comfortable going through progressions, making throws that, again, we just really haven't seen him do. So to me, those 2 stats right there are what make this the most impressive game, arguably, of his career, in my opinion. Being able to complete a very high rate of throws while also clearly pushing the ball downfield when you're at 10.5 per attempt. And I think it really helps. I know we're going to get into it a bit more, but to have the weapons that he had at his disposal, most notably Dallas Wilson. He makes his long-awaited, highly anticipated debut, and you can see that it really just changed the offense. We had high expectations for Wilson going in, as well as everyone did, but even still, I was surprised to see just how much his presence, whether he was getting the ball or not, lifted the offense, lifted the passing game, gave DJ something to work with, whether he was getting the ball or opening up other players. So all around the board, especially when you consider just how good this Texas defense has been this season and going back to last season, it's something that should give Florida fans a lot of optimism that, again, maybe they don't come out and match this every week, but at least they have something to build on, because through the first 4 games, they just didn't, you mentioned it being a career worst game for him against Miami after a career worst game against LSU. you're really thinking at that point, how can you go up from here? And that's exactly what he did. He silenced a lot of doubters, in my opinion, in this game. And it's going to be really important for him to pick up where he left off going into Texas A&M this week.
Yeah, he definitely had some help around him. We'll talk about the wide receivers here in a minute, but Jaden Baugh, 27 carries. That's a career high for him. He had a career high 109 rushing yards. Fans have been calling for him to have a larger share of the carries. And with Jacoby Jackson out for the game, and then Duke Clark comes in, has 9 carries for nearly 40 yards, and then he has to exit. Jaden Baugh was a workhorse for Florida on Saturday, which really made it so that Florida was multidimensional offensively, which is something that they needed to establish here. Offensively, they had not really been adequate in the passing game, but certainly could have gotten more out of the run game as well. We had mentioned last week to go back to last year at Texas. Florida had over 200 rushing yards. So getting that going again against the Longhorns really bodes well for the future. And having Baugh lead the way was something that a lot of people had been asking for. But no disrespect to DJ and no disrespect to Jaden Baugh, I think you could make a case that of the performances that were noteworthy offensively, they're probably second and third behind the debut of freshman wide receiver Dallas Wilson. Now, go back to what has been a really eventful 10 months for Dallas Wilson. He signs with Oregon, gets let out of the signed financial affidavit 2 weeks later, takes an official visit to Florida, and then ends up committing to Florida, enrolling in time for spring practice. Was a standout in spring camp. Zach, you noted on the message board, maybe it wouldn't have been as big of a surprise to Florida fans if they had read your comments, that you said he could be a Jeremiah Smith type player. That is a prediction that after this Saturday looks really, really good because he was just absolutely dynamic. And in my opinion, was a key reason why Florida's passing game was able to elevate itself. Had 6 catches, a game high for him among all players, of course, and 111 yards in his first ever game in the orange and blue. Just looked like a polished wide receiver, physical, made that impressive 55-yard, toe tapping, avoiding going out of bounds catch where he shrugged off a couple of defenders. Just looked like a man amongst boys, which is really impressive for a guy who's, 18, 19 years old. It was a really impressive debut, and it kind of verified a lot of the people who had been sitting here and wondering if not just more practice time for DJ Lagway would help Florida's offense, but getting a guy like Dallas Wilson back to help with Vernell Brown, getting Aiden Mizell back involved in the passing game, having the full stable of weapons, if that was going to help elevate Florida's offense. And I do think it's safe to say, albeit a small sample size, that after Saturday's game, Dallas Wilson is a difference maker for Florida's offense. What did you like about his performance? What stood out to you in terms of what Dallas Wilson was able to do? And how important is it moving forward to make him a key piece, a focal point of the offense, having seen what he can do in his debut on Saturday?
Yeah, you referenced my comment from, I want to say April, but even before that, I was telling our subscribers over at Swamp247 that he reminded me of Jeremiah Smith. And I didn't want to put like unfair expectations on him because I think Jeremiah Smith's freshman season at Ohio State was a legitimate anomaly, even for freshman receivers that we've seen come in and make immediate impacts with their team, especially in recent years. But it's more about the style of play, right? 6'3", 210, 215, athletic, can go up, immense catch radius and leaping ability to go and make contested grabs and acrobatic catches, but also has the ability to separate with his speed at that size. It's truly a very unique build. It's the prototypical X receiver. Another comparison I made from, and again, I'm not like trying to say like first team All-American, eventual NFL Pro Bowler after one game or one set of practices or offseason of practices. But the type of receiver you think of when you think of a prototypical X is like the Mike Evans types, right? The guy that you can put isolated on a corner and you trust that he's going to win 50-50 balls, one-on-one matchups more often than he's going to lose them. And that's exactly what he brought to the offense. He was able to go in that sideline toe tapper, right? Which Florida receivers have done that in recent years, catching the ball from DJ Lagway, Graham Mertz, Anthony Richardson. It's been a while since Florida's had someone that can actually go up and make those plays more often than not. The speed and physicality on that 55-yard touchdown to not only, out of his release, he dusted his cornerback. Then to go and do it against 2 guys trying to tackle him, just shrug him off, run him over. One of those is a first-team SEC safety. It's, again, like first game for him to come out and do that. 6 for 111 and 2 touchdowns. Those are all Florida records for receivers making their freshman debut with the Gators. It was extremely impressive. And to me, it's exactly why he does need to be the focal point of the receiving game. He is the type of one-on-one matchup weapon that defenses are going to dictate their coverages based off. So not only do you expect him to continue making plays and be a focal point, but when he demands that type of attention, especially at 18 years old, playing in what will be his second, third, fourth, and so on games at Florida, that will do wonders for a player like Vernell Brown out of the slot, who has, at this point, has been Florida's top receiver. And at points, because he's got the speed, he's got the athleticism, sharp route running ability. He's one smaller player out of the slot that defenses have been able to at times hone in on. This should do wonders for him. It should do wonders for Trey Wilson when he's on the field, even though we didn't get to see him take many advantage of many opportunities on Saturday. It should do a lot for J. Michael Sturdivant as he goes back into more of a Z role where he pairs with the slot on that side of the field. Defenses are not going to be able to fixate on who was perceived to be Florida's top two weapons without Wilson available. Now he, especially as the ISO guy, is going to demand a significant amount of attention that should do wonders for the rest of the passing game. So he's, to me, already one game in, one of, if not the most important player on this offense, sans DJ Lagway at this point.
Yeah, considering Florida's offensive futility for the previous 3 games before Saturday, it does beg the question at how much it would have helped Florida in those games against USF, Miami, LSU, if they could have had a guy like Dallas Wilson. But I do think, you can't dwell on the past. It was coupled with DJ Lagway's improved comfortability in the pocket, him getting more practice time, him getting that bye week of the full week of good-on-good reps. It was a combination of those things, but it does speak to how critical injuries are in this game. When you're missing one of your key players, you're going to often look not as potent offensively as you could look, and I think that is safe to say with Florida's offense. Now, the key is obviously to continue this moving forward, because, again, a very limited sample size, but certainly aided a much-needed victory for the Florida Gators, who had yet to be able to secure an FBS win so far. So with all that said, I know that those are the highlight reel plays. The quarterback, like Billy Napier and coaches love to say, is going to get too much of the credit sometimes and too much of the blame. It's about the guys around him. You've heard it. You've read it at Swamp247. He said it routinely. I do think he agrees with the assessment that this game is won in the trenches. It's won on the line of scrimmage. And we already noted Florida's offensive line protecting Lagway, helping establish running lanes for Baugh and Duke Clark, limiting the tackles for loss. But notably, this game was what many expected out of Florida's pass rush this season. Go back to spring and fall camp. Billy Napier said that the edge group is probably the deepest on any Florida, position group this season, but they didn't have the sacks to show for it. They were getting pressure and they were disrupting and limiting the run at a good rate, but they were not getting to the quarterback and bringing him down. They were affecting him at times, but they didn't have the sack numbers. Everything changed in that department on Saturday. Florida's pass rush looked much better. They were able to sack Manning 6 times. They pressured him 35 times. They had 8 quarterback hurries. This was a much better performance from Florida's defensive front, and notably, it came without multiple key guys available. Caleb Banks, who knows if or when he will return for Florida. Brendan Bett played very limited snaps because he suffered that injury against Miami. I think he only played 11, 12 snaps in the contest, a guy who started at Miami a couple weeks ago. They do get Mekhi Burrow back, and Brian Taylor Jr. had a really, really good performance, but Florida was still missing key guys. They were obviously missing, LJ McCray, which who knows when he is going to return to the roster to the team for Florida. They were certainly missing, Grayson Howard, who is something that we asked Billy Napier about today, a guy who didn't play on Saturday after being such a key cog in the defense a year ago. Zach, what did you make out of Florida's defensive line performance? I know that you've been reviewing the film of this game and are going to have an all-22 review coming later. So if you want more of Zach's thoughts on Florida's pass rush, you can check that out over at Swamp247 on Tuesday. But Zach, just what did you think about Florida's defensive line from watching the game Saturday and looking back at the film? What stood out to you? What did they do well?
Yeah, that's specifically going to be the focus of my all-22 review this week. I've not done much defense this season because we've had so much to look at, negatively about the offense, but I'm excited to do it because, this was like, you've seen the flashes, right? You were discussing it. I think they were averaging 7 or 8 quarterback pressures a game, which is not bad. They weren't getting the quarterback in the ground, but they were getting him off his spot at times, obviously shoring up the run game. They more than doubled their season total of quarterback pressures just against Texas alone. Again, you said 35. They had 34 going into the game. They tripled their sack count. They were at 3 for the season. They had 6 on Saturday. So it was the breakout party that I think people were starting to expect of them, and we're starting to wonder, like, when is this going to happen? And personally, like, we've seen, they like to rush they'll send simulated pressures where they may have a defensive end drop into coverage and send a linebacker. To me, it was what they changed. They blitzed a lot. Now, granted, they blitzed a lot against Miami too, and it wasn't as effective, but they sent it. They sent 5 quite often against Texas. I think it was about 42 to 45% of defensive or dropbacks, I should say, for Arch Manning. They sent at least 5 rushers. You saw Sharif Denson really hovering the line out of the star nickel position. Even Bryce Thornton came down and played a decent bit of star and was like right there off the edge, being sent as a 5th, going unblocked quite a few times. Texas didn't seem to have answers when they sent 5. And as a result, Arch Manning, I mean, there were a couple throws he missed that he probably should have been able to hit. And I think that's a discussion about just how good Arch Manning might be. But Florida was getting after it, especially with their rotation on the defensive line too. Brian Taylor, as you mentioned, 6 pressures, I think 1.5 sacks. He was kind of the wrecking ball. He was kind of the driving force of that group, and a lot of others followed his lead. You see Mekhi Barrow getting a sack in there and a couple of pressures. I mean, Devin Moore at cornerback, talk about blitzing. That's another one where they sent him from the outside, not even from the nickel position. He was able to get in there, get a sack. You had players from all 3 levels of the defense. Miles Graham and Aaron Childs and Jaden Robinson were also involved in the pass rush, whether it was the front 4 and the edge rushers, the second level in the defense, or even the cornerback, safeties, and stars. They had multiple players from each level get involved. I think each level had at least 1 sack and multiple pressures. That's aggressive. To me, that's different, even with this defense being known to at times be aggressive or at least unique with the rushes it'll send with the simulated pressures, where, again, that is only 4. That's not blitzing, but you'll see a safety rather than a defensive end, or you'll see a linebacker go rather than even sometimes a defensive tackle, which I hate, but that's its own thing. But this time around, they were willing to send the house, or not the entire house, but you guys know what I mean. Like, they were aggressive, taking guys out of coverage to go and get Manning off his spot, and it worked. Now, that's something that we'll have to look for a bit more this week, because there were times where even while they were aggressive and they were able to rattle Manning, there were moments where they also got out of their rush lanes, and that opened things up for Arch Manning to lead Texas in rushing by a pretty solid margin, with scrambles more so than designs. When you go into this Texas A&M game against Marcel Reed, who does more of the quarterback design runs, obviously Florida fans saw that last year, gap integrity is going to be really important. I think you'll probably see Florida take a step back from blitzing as a result of whether it's spying or having guys, on the second level in coverage a bit more who can crash down if he decides to run. But ultimately, again, this is the breakout party the pass rush needed. And as a result, again, Florida doubled and tripled its meaningful quarterback pressure and sack numbers as it had through 4 games. It was really everything you could have asked for.
Yeah, I think from a game plan perspective, Florida realized ahead of this game that Texas's offensive line, it's not Miami's, it's not LSU's even. I think they realized that it was a weak spot and that Florida could afford to dial up more blitzes and pressures and make an inexperienced quarterback in Arch Manning beat them. Even when he was facing pressure and was rattled, they were willing to live with the handful of big plays that he had a chance to make. And you saw him in that game overthrow a couple receivers, miss a few guys, and they ran a double pass too that just narrowly didn't work out for them. Florida was willing to gamble when it came to their defensive scheme, and I think it was a really good decision. It was a bold one, absolutely, and I'm intrigued to see if they're going to be able to get similar level of pressure moving forward here against a multitude of teams that have talented offensive lines. and more capable quarterbacks than Arch Manning right now, starting with this upcoming week at Texas A&M against Marcel Reed, who in my opinion is playing like one of the best quarterbacks in the nation, certainly deserves to be in the Heisman Trophy discussion, in my opinion. You look at how good Texas A&M's defense is, ranking top 10 in sacks and tackles for loss. They had 299 rushing yards against Mississippi State this past weekend. Marcel Reed certainly did damage against Florida a year ago when he came in and made his collegiate debut and had more than 250 yards in that 33-20 win. So it's a small sample size. It was promising, but Florida has to have it continue. Florida absolutely understands they cannot rest on their laurels. They deserve to celebrate this one on Saturday night and Sunday a little bit, but it's right back to work facing another top 5 team in the country. For a team that is still 2-3 and has a lot of work to do, they cannot get complacent, and they seem to understand that. So we will have another podcast coming later this week where we preview the matchup between Florida and Texas A&M. We'll have a Behind Enemy Lines with Carter Corrales over at Gig'em247 that you can check out. We'll be exchanging questions and a good bit more content and features coming in the week ahead. But that's going to do it for this episode of this 247 podcast. Before we get out of here, I got to say one more thing. We've talked about 2 of the 3 phases of the game. Let's give a shout out to board favorite Taylor Spierto. Give him some credit. A leader, 5th-year guy. Second blocked punt in the Billy Napier era, and the first one in, I believe, over a decade to count as a score for Florida. And given how that was a 1-score game down the stretch, Florida led by 8 and Texas had the ball with under a minute to play, that absolutely was a big play because Texas could have had a chance to win the thing if they had been able to score. And if Florida hadn't got that ball back on the safety, having to have the Longhorns punt it away. So absolutely a critical play. Florida played well in all 3 phases. Took advantage in the kicking game as well. Had an over 50-yard punt. 2 of Tommy Doman's 5 punts were down inside the 20-yard line. It was a complete game from Florida, or as complete of a game as we have seen from the Gators this season. But again, that's going to do it for this episode of the Swamp247 podcast. We'll be back later this week. For Zach Goodall, I'm Graham Hall, and we'll see you next time.